a young woman approaches Elon Musk with a job request, and his extraordinary response leaves the whole world speechless. What if you were told that a simple job request could change not only your life, but also the future of technology? Ethan Clark, a 23-year-old young man, grew up in a rundown industrial neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan, where the echoes of the collapse of the automotive industry still resonate. Since he was young, he witnessed the struggles his family faced, especially after the tragic loss of his father in a factory accident. That pain shaped him, transforming his vulnerability into a burning passion for innovation and job security. Graduating in mechatronics engineering, Ethan carries with him an audacious dream: to develop neural motion, an interface that connects the human brain to industrial machines, humanizing robotics in factories. His journey begins when, after months of frustrated attempts to contact his idol Elon Musk, he decides to take radical action. Armed with a bold letter and his prototype, Ethan crashes a SpaceX conference, determined to grab the tech mogul's attention. The setting is electrifying. Silicon Valley, a place where futuristic ideas become reality, but where dreams can also be crushed under the pressure of unrealistic expectations. However, what should have been a simple presentation turns into a monumental challenge when Musk, surprised by Ethan's audacity, puts him to the test. He must build a functional version of his prototype in just 30 days with limited resources. This task seems almost impossible, and the pressure mounts as Ethan finds himself struggling not only against time, but also against his own fears and insecurities. What is at stake goes beyond a job. It is the chance to make a difference in a world that often ignores the voices of the most vulnerable. Ethan Clark sat in a dark corner of the auditorium, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The SpaceX conference, one of the greatest victories of his life, was about to begin, but the prospect of presenting his idea to Elon Musk left him in tatters. Deep down, he knew that his entire future depended on that moment. The pressure was overwhelming, and doubt was a constant shadow that followed him. He looked at the neural motion prototype he carried in a battered backpack, remembering all the sleepless nights, the sketches piling up, and the frustrations he faced while trying to create something that could change the world. In the days that followed his audacious entry into the conference, Ethan began to realize that the challenge Musk had posed to him was more than just building a functional prototype. He needed to confront his own internal demons, the insecurity that had accompanied him since childhood, every criticism he had heard about his aspirations, every time he had felt like a failure. All of it accumulated like a storm inside him. He questioned whether he was truly capable of carrying this idea forward, whether his dream was just a mirage. Meanwhile, other conference attendees began to approach him. One of them was Sarah, a software engineer who had worked on artificial intelligence projects. She was impressed by Ethan's boldness and offered her help. Sarah was a determined woman who knew what it was like to fight in a male-dominated environment and was willing to share her experiences. "You're not alone in this. Let's do it together," she said with an encouraging smile. Her support was a balm for Ethan, but it also left him vulnerable. He feared that by trusting someone, he might end up disappointing her. However, not everyone was willing to help him. There was Mark, a young tech prodigy who saw Ethan as a threat. He was arrogant and didn't hesitate to make sarcastic comments about Ethan's prototype. "Do you really think such a simple idea will impress Elon?" Mark asked, his mocking tone echoing in Ethan's mind. Every word from Mark felt like a stab, and Ethan's insecurity intensified. He felt he needed to prove his worth not only to Musk, but to everyone around him. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure increased exponentially. Ethan struggled to balance working on his prototype and the need to stay motivated. He spent sleepless nights surrounded by tools and electronic components, while the image of his father, a man who always believed in his potential, haunted him. The pain of loss was still intense, and he questioned whether he was doing what his father would have wanted him to do. The idea of failing, of not honoring his memory, was a weight that pressed down on his shoulders. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any videos, and let us know which city you're watching this video from in the comments. The small victories that Ethan achieved with Sarah's help were not enough to dissipate his doubts. He often found himself paralyzed by anxiety, unable to move forward. In a moment of weakness, he almost gave up, thinking it might be easier to go back to Detroit and leave his dreams behind. But in an honest conversation with Sarah, he found the courage to continue. We all face challenges. What matters is how we respond to them, she said, and those words echoed in his mind. As time passed, the emotional connection between Ethan and Sarah grew stronger. They were no longer just colleagues, they were becoming friends. They shared their hopes and fears, laughing and crying together. This newly formed friendship brought new energy to Ethan, but it also added complications. He began to worry about the possibility of failing, not just for himself, but also for Sarah. This new dimension of responsibility challenged him to go beyond his limits, to strive even harder, not only to fulfill the task, but also to honor the trust she had placed in him. As the days approached the deadline, Ethan realized that the challenges ahead were more than technical. They were an internal struggle. Each obstacle that arose not only tested his skills, but also his deepest convictions. He needed not only a functional prototype, but something that could truly impact people's lives. The idea of creating an interface that not only humanized robotics, but also provided safety for workers, became a beacon amid the storm of uncertainties surrounding him. And as the pressure mounted, Ethan found himself forced to confront not only his fears, but also his deepest aspirations in search of a future worth fighting for. As Ethan dedicated himself to improving his prototype, new challenges began to emerge, further complicating his journey. The pressure from the conference was not only external, he started to feel the weight of the expectations piling up on his shoulders. The deadline was approaching, and with it, his nights of sleep became even scarcer. He found himself battling fatigue, his body exhausted and his mind in a constant state of fog. Each day, the line between determination and exhaustion grew thinner, and the idea of failure transformed into a monster that slowly consumed him. Ethan also faced an unexpected obstacle, a critical failure in the prototype. During a preliminary demonstration for a select group of investors, the device crashed, leaving him in an awkward silence. The look of disappointment on the faces of those present was like a sharp blade. The insecurity he tried to bury resurfaced with full force, and he felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Upon returning to his corner of the auditorium, shame enveloped him in a heavy cloak, making him doubt his ability to move forward. The situation became even more complicated when Sarah, his ally and friend, had to step away temporarily for personal reasons. Her absence left a significant void in his emotional and intellectual support. With Sarah off stage, Ethan found himself struggling not only against his own demons, but also against the loneliness that consumed him. He realized that without her encouragement, his determination was waning. The conversations that once brought clarity and strength became distant echoes in his mind. The external pressure, now amplified by the absence of someone he trusted, felt overwhelming. Meanwhile, Mark continued to be a thorn in his side. With Sarah gone, Mark did not hesitate to intensify his provocations, making malicious comments that cut even deeper. He exploited Ethan's vulnerability, stirring doubts that were already present. "I think you're not ready for this, Ethan. Maybe you should think of something more realistic," he said, his voice laced with disdain. Every criticism from Mark echoed in his mind, making him doubt whether he really had what it took to impress Musk. The tension between them grew, and Ethan felt increasingly isolated in his struggle. As the presentation date approached, Ethan realized that his emotions were on edge. He felt like a ship adrift, battling the storm brewing inside him. The pressure turned into a vicious cycle. The more he tried to focus on his work, the more fears and insecurities emerged, leading to even worse performance. He began to wonder if he should give up, if he should return to Detroit and accept a life that didn't demand so much from him. The idea of failing, of disappointing not just himself, but also the memory of his father, haunted him relentlessly. It was in a moment of despair that Ethan caught a glimpse of hope. He decided, against all odds, to seek help. In a casual conversation with a mentor he had met at the conference, he shared his frustrations and doubts. The mentor listened attentively and wisely said, "True innovation comes from vulnerability. Don't be afraid to show your weaknesses." That's what connects people to your idea. This conversation ignited a new spark within Ethan. He realized that instead of hiding his insecurities, he could use them as a source of strength. With this new perspective, Ethan began to work on his prototype again, not just as an inventor, but as someone who had a story to tell. He incorporated his experiences and emotions into his presentation, something he had never considered before. This transformation not only began to change his prototype, but also his way of approaching the challenge. The emotional connection he was forming with his creation intensified as he prepared for the culminating moment that could change his destiny. He knew that regardless of the outcome, he had transformed, and that mattered more than any prize or recognition. Ethan was at his lowest point. After the prototype failure and the mounting pressure, he felt like a castaway in a sea of insecurities. As he worked in his lab, the daylight began to fade, and loneliness became his only companion. He looked at the parts of the device scattered across the table, each representing not only his hard work, but also his frustrations. The weight of expectations, both personal and professional, pressed down on him like a rock. In a moment of despair, he decided to take a walk to clear his mind. He walked through the city streets, reflecting on everything he had been through. The noise of cars, the voices of people, and even the bright lights seemed distant, as if he were in a separate world. It was then that, passing through a small square, something caught his attention. A group of children was playing with a simple toy, a colorful kite dancing in the wind. Their innocent laughter, free from worries, made Ethan stop. He remembered his childhood when curiosity and imagination were his greatest allies. This moment of simplicity touched something deep within him. Ethan realized that he had been so focused on impressions and expectations that he had forgotten the essence of innovation, the joy of creating. He remembered his father, who always encouraged him to explore and dream big, unafraid of failure. His father's optimistic view of both achievements and failures inspired him to rediscover his passion. He was not just building a prototype, he was trying to create something that could impact the world, something that could bring joy and hope. With this new perspective, Ethan returned to the lab with renewed enthusiasm. He no longer wanted to just present a product, he wanted to tell a story. He began to rethink his prototype, not as a cold, impersonal device, but as an extension of his own journey. With that, he decided to incorporate elements that reflected his experiences and emotions. Each part of the device now told a piece of his story, motivating him to work with more fervor. As the days passed, Ethan felt that he was transforming. The pressure that had once been overwhelming now became fuel. He allowed himself to feel and express his vulnerabilities, which helped him connect more deeply with his creation. He began practicing his presentation, not as a rehearsed speech, but as a genuine conversation. He wanted those who listened to feel his passion, his struggle, and above all, his hope. However, Mark's provocations did not diminish. The rival, noticing the change in Ethan, intensified his attacks, trying to undermine the confidence that Ethan was rebuilding. But this time, instead of letting it shake him, Ethan used it as motivation. He realized that Mark's criticism was a reflection of his own insecurities and decided not to let it affect him. With each insult, he remembered the laughter of the children and the unconditional support of his father. Finally, on the eve of the presentation, As he looked at the now modified prototype, Ethan felt a wave of relief and gratitude. He was no longer just fighting against his own weaknesses, but approaching a new beginning. What once seemed an insurmountable mountain was now an opportunity for growth. He knew that regardless of the outcome, he had found his purpose again. The anticipation of presenting to such a large audience no longer terrified him. Instead, he was eager to share his story. Ethan had risen again, not just as an inventor, but as a human being who embraced his flaws and transformed them into strength. What had once been a dark path was now illuminated with possibilities, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The journey was not over, but the direction had changed, and that was all that mattered. Ethan was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The room was filled with people, curious eyes fixed on him, and the weight of expectation became almost unbearable. He took a deep breath, feeling his heart race. Mark, his rival, was in the front row, a disdainful smile on his lips, as if waiting for his failure. The prototype, now a representation of his struggles and triumphs, was before him, bright and ready to be presented. But deep down, Ethan knew it was not just a technical demonstration. It was a testament to his journey, to his resilience. He began the presentation, his voice initially hesitant, but soon transformed into a flow of emotion. He shared his story, spoke about the difficulties he faced, the criticism he received, and the rediscovery of his passion. Every word that came from his mouth was imbued with the authenticity he had cultivated. The room filled with palpable tension. The audience was with him, but Mark was there, watching with a cynical gaze, ready to attack. At the climax of his presentation, something unexpected happened. One of the components of the prototype, which had worked perfectly during testing, began to fail. Lights flickered and an alarm went off. Ethan felt his stomach churn, fear flooding him. The insecurity he had fought so hard to overcome threatened to resurface. He looked at Mark, who was poised to take the opportunity to discredit him. It was the decisive moment. The pressure was unbearable, but instead of letting himself be defeated, Ethan remembered the laughter of the children in the square, the support of his father, and everything he had learned. He paused, took a deep breath, and decided that he would not let a mistake define him. With unexpected calmness, he addressed the audience. He said, "This is part of the creative process. Innovation is not a straight line. It is full of ups and downs. What matters is how we rise after failures." His words resonated in the room, and he saw some heads nodding. Ethan then focused, adjusting the controls of the prototype. He began to explain what was happening, sharing his reasoning, transforming a potential defeat into a live lesson. He was not just presenting a technical solution, he was showing the importance of facing challenges and learning from them. The audience was captivated, and even Mark seemed to hesitate. With a final touch, Ethan made an adjustment that stabilized the device. The lights came on again, and the prototype worked flawlessly. A mix of relief and joy washed over him. But the most important thing was that he had overcome his greatest fear, the lack of control. He had learned that failing was not the end, but an opportunity for growth. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Ethan felt a wave of emotion sweep over him. He had faced his biggest obstacle, not just a technical challenge, but his own insecurities. He realized that true victory was not just in presenting a successful prototype, but in sharing his journey of self-discovery and resilience. With shining eyes, he looked at Mark, who now seemed perplexed. Ethan's victory was not just about the prototype, but about the transformation he had undergone. He had freed himself from the shackles of fear and criticism, and that was more powerful than any prize or recognition. The emotional impact was tangible. He felt the connection with the audience, and many stood up, applauding not only the success of the prototype, but the courage of a man who had chosen to turn his pain into strength. Ethan left the stage with the certainty that he had found his true purpose. He had not only risen again, but had reinvented himself, ready to face any challenge that life still had in store for him. Ethan walked off the stage to deafening applause, feeling the adrenaline pulse through his veins. The energy of the room enveloped him, but he was no longer the same. What once seemed like a simple professional challenge had now transformed into a journey of self-discovery. The failure of the prototype, which had initially terrified him, had become a symbol of his resilience. He realized that true innovation was not just in success, but in the courage to face one's own fears and learn from them. The consequences of his presentation spread quickly. Colleagues and mentors congratulated him, but the most meaningful words of support came from people he barely knew, who approached him to share how his story had inspired changes in their own lives. The connection he felt with the audience was palpable, and it filled him with a new purpose. He understood that his work could impact not only technology, but people's lives. Meanwhile, Mark, who once seemed like a threatening shadow, now appeared more contemplative. Ethan noticed that his rival was no longer just cynical. There was a spark of respect in his gaze. This change was a reflection of the transformation Ethan had experienced. He was not there to compete, but to share and collaborate. Healthy competition had become an opportunity for mutual learning. In a moment of reflection, Ethan remembered all the sleepless nights, the doubts, and the criticisms. He recognized that every sacrifice had been worth it. The journey had not been in vain. He had found strength in his weaknesses and a purpose in his passion. He knew that success would not be measured solely in awards, but in the ability to inspire others to rise after their falls. With this new understanding, Ethan decided it was time for a fresh start. Not just in his career, but in his life. He began planning initiatives that could help young inventors and creators overcome their own challenges. The idea of a mentorship program took shape in his mind, and he was determined to share his knowledge and experience with those who could benefit. Thus, Ethan's journey transformed into a beacon of hope and inspiration. He not only restarted his professional path, but also committed to being a positive force in the lives of others. He knew that every failure he faced had prepared him for this new chapter, and now he was ready to embrace the future with confidence and determination. The fresh start was not just a new chance. It was an opportunity to shape a legacy of empowerment and resilience that he hoped would echo in the lives of many to come.